black boy, often lost in his own thoughts during class, was suddenly called out by his teacher. He was forced to stand up and face a problem far beyond his level. His classmates, some laughing, some skeptical, all looked at him with suspicious eyes. But what they didn't know was that the boy standing before the board, the one they always looked down on, was actually a hidden math genius. The clock on the wall read 8 a.m. Sunlight streamed through the window of Riverside Middle School in Atlanta, casting faint streaks of light across the old desks. The classroom was filled with noise, laughter, chairs scraping, books banging together. But amidst all the chaos, there was a boy sitting quietly at the back of the room, avoiding every glance as if trying to disappear into the air. Jamal Carter, 13 years old, was one of the most overlooked students in the class. He didn't cause a stir, didn't engage in conversations, and especially never raised his hand to speak. He simply observed quietly, like a shadow drifting through a sea of people. Outside the school gates, Jamal's life was unlike any other kid's life here. His father had been a Navy SEAL captain, a strong man with a steel will. But after leaving the military, he couldn't find a job that matched his years of service to the country. Eventually, he took a night job as a warehouse guard to support the family. That grueling job meant he was rarely home, and when he did return, he was exhausted, barely able to sit in the old chair before falling asleep. His mother did various odd jobs, from cleaning houses, working at a supermarket, to sewing clothes to make ends meet for her 2 children. She worked from morning until night, but the money still wasn't enough to cover rent and bills. As the oldest, Jamal had many responsibilities. He took care of his younger brother, helped his mother with work, and even took on odd jobs after school to make extra money. Some nights, he was so tired he would fall asleep at his desk without even having dinner. Due to missing so many school days, Jamal was held back. He should have been in 9th grade by now, but here he was, sitting among his peers who had much easier lives. Jamal wasn't dumb, but being held back made him the target of mockery. Look at the kid who got held back. He probably doesn't even know how to read. Why is he still here? Whispers and sneers followed him every time he walked into class. At first, it hurt, but eventually he learned to stay silent and endure. If he didn't react, people would forget about him faster. He never answered the teacher, never participated in lessons. When someone asked about the work, he pretended not to know. But the truth was, he knew a lot. While his classmates struggled with basic problems, Jamal was drawn to more complex equations. At the back of his notebook were not the usual notes, but advanced formulas, self-made problems, and detailed solutions. On nights when he couldn't sleep, he would sit under the dim light of his old desk lamp, flipping through textbooks he borrowed from the library. On days when he couldn't make it to class, he would teach himself things his friends had never even heard of. And when he sat in class, instead of listening to the repetitive lessons, he solved his own problems. He loved math, but no one knew. No one realized that this kid who had been held back was far smarter than they thought. Jamal didn't care about grades, nor did he need any praise. He just wanted to exist quietly, so no one would notice him anymore. But little did he know, today would change everything. The sun was high, streaming through the classroom window, its golden rays casting over the whiteboard, reflecting off the glasses of Mrs. Amanda Thompson, the 8B math teacher. She stood at the front of the class with a confident and authoritative stance, her gaze sweeping over each student's face as though she were a stern judge, deliberating on the scores of contestants. She wasn't the type of teacher to go easy on her students. She didn't believe in compromising with laziness or lack of effort. With over 20 years of teaching experience, she prided herself on being able to see through each student just by their behavior in class. The hardworking and promising ones she could spot instantly. As for the indifferent, unmotivated ones, she wasn't afraid to publicly criticize them. And in her eyes, Jamal Carter belonged to the second group. She had observed him for a long time, noting how he always sat in the corner, his gaze often absent, staring out the window. He never raised his hand to speak, nor did he ever seem interested in the lesson. To Mrs. Thompson, this behavior could only mean one thing. This boy doesn't care about learning. In fact, she had never spoken to Jamal for more than a few moments. The few times she did pay attention to him were when she saw him resting his chin in his hand, gazing out the window, or flipping through his notebook absent-mindedly. There was no sign that he made any effort or tried to integrate into the class. But what bothered her the most was that Jamal had been held back a year. In her mind, students who were held back were usually lazy, undisciplined, or simply failed to complete their homework or study properly. She never considered that there might be other reasons, things that didn't show up on report cards or attendance sheets. That morning, she walked into the classroom in a bad mood. She had spent the entire evening grading tests, and the results had left her deeply disappointed. She wasn't an easy teacher, and she was extremely strict when it came to grading. But even with her minimum standards in place, too many students had failed the test. Mistakes in calculations, sloppy steps in solving problems, careless numbers hastily written down, all of it was a mess she couldn't tolerate. How could a lesson that she had repeated over and over for weeks be misunderstood so badly by her students? "They're not even trying," she muttered to herself, clutching the stack of graded tests in her hand, the pages smudged with red ink. She continued flipping through the tests, marking the wrong answers and leaving harsh comments. But when she reached the last test in the pile, she suddenly stopped. 100%. A perfect score, not a single mistake. She squinted, scanning each step of the solution. Every calculation was flawless, the reasoning clear and structured in a way that couldn't be questioned. But when she looked down at the bottom of the test, the student's name left her stunned. Jamal Carter. She looked at the test again, trying to find the tiniest mistake, anything that might suggest the student had been lucky or guessed the answers right. But there was nothing. She should have felt proud that one of her students had scored full marks, but instead, she felt a sense of unease. How could a student who had never spoken up, who had never shown any interest, who sat in the back of the class like a shadow, produce such a perfect test? Her instincts told her something wasn't right. The first thought that crossed her mind was cheating. It wasn't the first time she had seen lazy students trying to outsmart teachers by copying from someone else. But Jamal's test didn't look like a copy. It was presented clearly, with a solid thought process, not the hasty kind of copying she was used to seeing. The second thought that annoyed her even more was, if he's this good, why has he never shown it? She felt insulted. As a teacher with over 20 years of experience in teaching math, she couldn't accept that a student could be good but not show it. If Jamal had the ability, then he had hidden it all this time. And that, to her, was a disrespect to her, to the class, and to the subject of math itself. She couldn't let this slide. Mrs. Thompson slowly put the test down on the desk, looking up at the class with a sharper gaze than usual. A storm of anger was brewing inside her. Today, she wouldn't let Jamal continue to hide. If he was really as good as his test suggested, he'd prove it now. She looked toward the back of the class, where Jamal Carter was resting his chin in his hand, his gaze once again fixed on the window as usual. A cold smile flickered across her lips. "All right, Jamal. If you think you can hide your talent, then today I'm going to bring you into the light." The atmosphere in the classroom suddenly fell silent, as if a cold breeze had just swept through. The pages of the books were still open. The pens remained on the desks, but all eyes were now focused in one direction: Jamal Carter. He startled when he heard his name, not from a fellow student, but from Mrs. Thompson's sharp, authoritative voice. "Jamal Carter, you seem very interested in something outside the window. Come up here." She stood at the front of the class, arms crossed, her gaze seeming to pierce through his silent exterior. There was nowhere left to hide. In that moment, Jamal could feel the change in the air around him. The whispers suddenly turned into giggling, full of hidden meaning. Is it him again? Is that guy still here? He'll probably be stuck in 8th grade for years. He's about to get embarrassed. Let's see how he gets out of this one. He could hear it all, even though no one spoke directly to him. The discomfort, the humiliation crept into his heart, but he didn't react. He was used to it. Jamal took a deep breath. He didn't want to stand up, didn't want to face whatever awaited him ahead, but from deep within, a voice echoed, "You can't hide forever, Jamal." His chair creaked as he slowly stood up. Every movement of his became the center of attention. Every step on the floor rang louder than ever. He felt the prying eyes from all sides, as if the whole class was waiting for a show of failure. He walked to the board. Mrs. Thompson didn't say anything for a few seconds. She just stared at him. A gaze not filled with expectation, not with encouragement, but with challenge. She could feel Jamal's anxiety, could see the tension in every one of his movements. But that was exactly what she wanted. She wanted him to feel the pressure. Let's see. Mrs. Thompson slowly stepped aside, picked up a pen, and began writing on the board. Numbers gradually appeared, a problem far from simple. This problem wasn't meant for an ordinary 8th grader. It had complex variables, calculations that required quick thinking, even beyond what had been taught in class. She placed the pen down on the desk, then turned around, offering a faint smile. If you were truly paying attention in class, you'd definitely solve this problem. The class fell silent for a moment. Then the laughter echoed again. Jamal stared at the numbers on the board, feeling as though the entire world was shrinking. He knew this problem. He had solved harder ones before, but not in front of the entire class, not in the atmosphere that seemed to expect him to fail. A part of him wanted to turn away, wanted to say he didn't know, wanted to return to his familiar corner of the room and let this day pass like any other. But another part of him, a stronger part, was trying to push him out of his fear. You've solved problems like this hundreds of times, Jamal. Not for the grades, not for anyone else, but because you love them. He swallowed hard, then slowly reached for the pen. No one noticed that this was the moment that would change everything. Jamal gripped the pen tightly in his hand, his palm beginning to sweat. In front of him, the whiteboard was covered with complex mathematical symbols, dense numbers written in Mrs. Thompson's sharp handwriting. Everything looked so tangled, nothing like the usual exercises the class had done. But that was exactly what she intended. Jamal could clearly sense the calculated setup. Mrs. Thompson hadn't chosen a typical math problem. She'd selected one far beyond the 8th grade curriculum, an impossible challenge for any student in the class. This wasn't a test of comprehension, but a public examination, a declaration of war. He could hear the muffled giggles coming from behind him. The whispers were soft, but loud enough for him to hear, like tiny needles piercing his self-esteem. He's frozen up now. No idea where to start. Why doesn't Mrs. Thompson just let him sit down? It's painful to watch. Jamal knew what they were waiting for. They were waiting for him to lower his head in embarrassment, stammer an apology, or worse, run out of the room. This was what they wanted to see most. The humiliation of a child held back in class, someone they had always assumed to be inferior to them. He could almost feel Mrs. Thompson's gaze examining every expression on his face, waiting for the first sign of confusion, waiting for the moment he would give up. But Jamal wouldn't give her that privilege. He didn't blink, didn't turn to look at anyone in the class. He kept a firm grip on the pen, took a deep breath. He had felt pressure in front of crowds before, but today he wasn't allowing himself to be weak. He could do this. He knew he could. The question wasn't whether he had the ability, but whether he had the courage to show it. His thoughts quickly returned to the problem before him. He didn't care who was waiting for him to fail. The only thing that mattered were the numbers that needed decoding. With a decisive motion, he brought the pen down to the board. The classroom immediately fell silent. At first, Jamal's handwriting was slow and cautious, as if he were double-checking every step in his mind before writing it down. But after a few seconds, his hand began to move faster, more naturally across the board. The numbers and symbols appeared clearly, methodically, each step being laid out with precision. The whispers gradually faded away. The students who had laughed at him earlier now fell silent, their eyes wide as they watched the equations take shape before them. Jamal didn't need to think long. He saw the pattern in the problem almost immediately. He broke it down into smaller parts, peeled apart each variable, analyzing every component smoothly. He wasn't just solving a math problem. He was unraveling a mystery, leading everyone through his logical process. The more he wrote, the more confident his hand became. The hesitation from before was completely gone. "Wait," a voice rang out from the back of the room. It no longer carried the mocking tone it once had. It was filled with astonishment. "He's actually doing it." Another student leaned forward, eyes fixed on the board as if in disbelief. "What the hell? How does he know how to do this?" Jamal didn't care about the whispers anymore. He was completely focused. Everything around him seemed to fade. The mocking smiles, the contemptuous glances, they all disappeared. It was just him and the problem before him. Never before had the world seemed so clear. His hand moved faster across the board. He eliminated unnecessary steps, finding the most efficient way to solve it. Each step he wrote wasn't a panicked reaction, but a firm confidence, as if he had known the answer from the very first moment. He continued writing, continued analyzing, continued proving that every assumption in the problem led to the same single answer. He was mastering the numbers, each variable in the equation following the exact pattern he had identified earlier. Then, after a brief moment, he wrote the final equal sign. There was no sound around him. Jamal set the pen down and turned around. The entire class was frozen in absolute silence. The students who had mocked him earlier were now wide-eyed, unable to say a word. But the reaction he most anticipated was Mrs. Thompson's, and he didn't have to wait long. She stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the board as she checked every number he had written. Her face no longer wore the mocking smile from before, but instead, it was unreadable. She scanned each step, her eyes slowly moving from top to bottom, left to right. Jamal stayed silent, but inside, his heart was taut like a bowstring. He knew he was right, but he wanted her to admit it. Finally, Mrs. Thompson stopped. She stood up straight, still holding the pen tightly. 1 second passed, then 2. A brief flicker of surprise flashed in her eyes, but it disappeared so quickly that no one but Jamal noticed. Then her voice came, but this time it wasn't as cold as before. "The answer is completely correct." A wave of astonishment swept through the classroom. A few students dropped their jaws. Whispers began, But this time, they weren't mocking. They were filled with utter disbelief. Jamal didn't say anything. He just stood there, listening to the murmurs grow louder. But inside, something had changed forever. He was no longer invisible. He had just stepped into the light, and there was no turning back. Mrs. Thompson's words still echoed in Jamal's head, but now they no longer carried mockery or challenge. It was an acknowledgement, something she hadn't expected to say in front of the whole class. He stood there, his breath still heavy from the intense moments, but inside there was a strange feeling he had never experienced before. It wasn't fear nor worry, but a sense of liberation. Everything seemed to slow down in that moment, and then, as if carried by a current, he was pulled back to those late nights spent in silence, where the yellowing lights were the only thing that illuminated his world. Jamal remembered the nights alone in his small room, flipping through the pages of the tattered and faded books he found in the public library. These weren't the books assigned in class, not the textbooks from the regular curriculum. These books were filled with problems far beyond the level of 8th grade, equations that a child with no one to guide them could easily feel helpless staring at. But for Jamal, it was a challenge, a captivating exploration he couldn't resist. He didn't study these things for grades. No one forced him to. He didn't have a private tutor or any help. He studied because it was the only way he could control a small part of his world. While life outside was unfair and full of struggles, while he was mocked, belittled, and his family struggled to make ends meet, numbers didn't judge him, didn't assess him by his past, didn't care if he was held back a grade. Mathematics only had one rule: either it's right or it's wrong. And that's why he had solved the problem on the board today. Not by luck, not by cheating, but because he had done problems harder than this hundreds of times, in the quiet nights when no one knew. There were nights when his mom had fallen asleep after a long, exhausting day, when his little brother was deep in his sleep, and Jamal would quietly turn on his small desk lamp. The faint light would fall on his old notebook, where the pages were filled with equations. He would frown, his pencil quickly moving across the page, drawing out lines of reasoning, erasing mistakes, starting over. There were times when he felt stuck. The problems were too difficult. The solutions seemed to go in circles without getting anywhere. But every time he felt like giving up, he would remember a deep, familiar voice echoing in his mind. Jamal remembered the rare times his dad had time to be home, the moments when he wasn't passed out on the couch from exhaustion after a long shift. His dad wasn't one for many words, but whenever he spoke, his words carried the weight of commands on a battlefield. He remembered one evening, when he was younger, and his dad was still in the military, dressed in his navy blue uniform, his eyes sharp but full of love. "Jamal, do you know why our SEAL team is the best special forces in the world?" Jamal shook his head. "Because we don't give up." He remembered how his dad looked him straight in the eyes when he said that, his hand firmly placed on his shoulder, transferring to him a strange strength. No matter how hard it gets, you cannot give up. When you face a challenge, you have two choices: run or fight. But if you run once, you will have to run for the rest of your life. When you step into the fight, you must see it through. Those words weren't just a lesson for a soldier. It became a part of Jamal, a principle he etched deeply into his mind. And tonight, in front of the whiteboard, in front of Mrs. Thompson's challenging gaze and the entire class, he chose to fight rather than run. The murmurs grew louder, pulling Jamal back to reality. He could clearly see the change on the faces of every student in the class. Before, their gaze had been filled with contempt, mockery. But now, it was amazement, curiosity, even a bit of hesitation. He hadn't just solved the problem, He had shattered every stereotype. Mrs. Thompson was still standing there, her eyes glued to the board, her expression stiff, as though she couldn't believe what was happening. For the first time, she had no mocking words for him. Jamal said nothing. He just looked directly at her, holding on to the silence that was thick with meaning. She might think of him as a lazy student. She might think he didn't deserve the high grades. She might believe he was a child left behind. But now, she couldn't deny the truth standing right in front of her. She was wrong, and Jamal knew this was just the beginning. Jamal stood there, his breath still heavy after the tense moments, but inside, something had changed. He had just proven to the whole class, to Mrs. Thompson, to those who had looked down on him, that he was not just a kid who had been held back. He was someone with capability, someone not to be underestimated. But more importantly, he had proven to himself that he could do it. He lowered his pen from the board, took a step back, and looked at the completed solution. Everything was clear, each line of reasoning logical, every calculation accurate. There was no room for doubt. This was not a rushed answer or a lucky guess. It was the work of someone who understood every number he placed. The room around him was completely silent. The students who had once mocked him, eagerly awaiting the moment he would be embarrassed, now were too afraid to speak. They all stared at the board, where the numbers Jamal wrote were gaining more weight than ever before. No one in the class could ignore what was happening in front of them. Each variable Jamal unraveled. Each equation he logically arranged. There was no panic, no sign of guessing. It all made perfect sense. A few students leaned forward, trying to check if there was any flaw in his solution, but they couldn't find one. Wait, he's really doing this right. A voice came from the back row, no longer mocking as before. It was filled with astonishment, tinged with a bit of confusion. A few others exchanged glances, but no one dared to say anything more. They didn't know how to react to what was unfolding. But the most important reaction didn't come from the students. It came from Mrs. Thompson. She stood there, unmoving. Her gaze no longer held the mocking tone, the challenge laced with sarcasm that it had at the beginning. Instead, it was filled with confusion, then amazement. She stared at the solution, as if trying to find a mistake, an error to invalidate everything he had just done. But she couldn't. Her lips pressed together. Her breath slowed, no longer steady like before. This was not the outcome she had hoped for. She had set a trap designed to make Jamal stumble, to force him to admit he wasn't good enough, to prove she was right in thinking so little of him. But now, she was the one caught off guard. Jamal had done it. Not just done it, but done it perfectly. She couldn't deny that truth. Jamal knew he had won when he saw Mrs. Thompson step forward, her gaze still fixed on the whiteboard. She looked at each line of writing, each number, each operation, as if trying to verify one last time that this wasn't a trick. She raised her hand, took the pen, and drew a short line beneath the final answer. The class held its breath. Then, her voice spoke, no longer loud as before, no longer cold as when she called him to the board. It was softer, slower, as though every word was being carefully considered. The answer is correct. Jamal heard a sigh of relief from some of the students. A few whispered to each other, exchanging astonished glances. But what caught his attention the most was Mrs. Thompson's gaze. For the first time, it no longer carried contempt. Not exactly respect, but at least she had begun to look at him differently. Then someone started to clap. At first, it was just a single clap, then another, then more, until the whole class erupted in astonished applause. Jamal wasn't used to this feeling. He had never stood in front of a crowd and been acknowledged. He didn't know what to do in that moment. But as the clapping filled the room, as the eyes around him began to look at him with a respect he had never received, he knew something had truly changed. Mrs. Thompson didn't clap. She stood there, silent, her face still unreadable. But when Jamal looked at her, he saw something different in her eyes. Not failure, not anger, just a little respect, a recognition that she didn't want to say aloud. And for Jamal, that was enough. He didn't need anyone to declare that he was good. He didn't need anyone to say he deserved more than they thought. He had proven that himself. With his own hands, with numbers that didn't lie, with the perseverance he had honed during long nights alone with old textbooks. Jamal felt lighter than ever before. As the applause died down, as the class slowly returned to its normal atmosphere, Jamal walked back to his seat. But this time, he no longer felt invisible. He had once thought he had to hide, to keep everything in the dark. But now, he knew he didn't have to anymore. He could stand in front of the class without lowering his head. He could let the world see who he was. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to do that. Jamal turned his back to face the entire class, his breath still heavy after the intense moments. But the only thing he could feel right now wasn't fear or pressure anymore. It was something deeper, stronger. A feeling he had never experienced during all the years spent silently sitting in the corner of the classroom, always trying to make sure no one noticed him. The problem was solved. Every number, every variable matched perfectly. Every step taken without hesitation or getting lost. There was no guessing, no mistakes. Everything linked together according to the rules he had imagined the moment he put pen to paper. The silence in the classroom was still strangely profound. A silence not born from indifference, but from sheer astonishment. He could feel the eyes on him, the mouths that had mocked him just moments ago now incapable of saying a word. The kids who always believed he was a failure, a student held back with nothing remarkable about him, were now sitting still, staring at the whiteboard, where the equations they thought he couldn't possibly solve stood clearly before them. Someone spoke up, their voice no longer mocking but laced with confusion. Wait, is he really doing it? That one sentence was like a stone thrown into a still pond, creating ripples that spread far and wide. Other students began to whisper, but no longer with mocking laughter. No way, he really did it. This problem is harder than anything we've learned. But he did it in just a few minutes. How the heck? Eyes exchanged glances. Heads leaned forward in a desperate attempt to find something wrong. But the more they looked, the more they couldn't find a single flaw. No one could believe what was happening right before their eyes. But whether they liked it or not, the truth was glaring on the whiteboard. The lines were long, each equation written with confidence, each formula connected systematically, everything flawless to the point that no one could argue. The kid they all once looked down on had now left the entire class in stunned silence. Jamal didn't need to turn around to sense Mrs. Thompson's reaction. Her prolonged silence no longer felt like the authoritative gaze of a teacher, but like someone confronting an undeniable truth they didn't want to accept. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't imagined that the boy she always considered undisciplined could stand before the class and do something no one thought he was capable of. She was sure Jamal would fail, that he'd freeze up, that he wouldn't be able to do anything except bow his head in shame. But instead, he had proven her wrong, completely wrong, to the point where even she was speechless, unable to figure out how to respond. Her eyes were still on the problem on the board, her usual sharp gaze now showing signs of wavering. She took a step forward, still saying nothing, but Jamal could feel her every breath, could see her hand gripping the pen, as though holding back something she couldn't express. She raised her hand, the pen moving slowly across the board, sliding over each line, each equation, each step he had written. She examined every detail, every number, stopping at a few points as if trying to find the smallest mistake to dismiss everything, but the more she examined, the more she couldn't find any errors. That moment stretched on, so long that the whole class seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. No one dared to speak. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Everyone was waiting for a final judgment from the teacher who had stood before them for so many years with her unyielding strictness. And then she lowered her pen, slightly turned towards Jamal, her expression still unreadable, but when she spoke, her voice no longer carried the challenge it once had. "The solution is correct." Whispers erupted immediately. The students who had just mocked Jamal moments ago were now looking at him with different eyes. They weren't laughing anymore, no longer talking about how he was a student who had been held back or how he was an invisible figure in class. Instead, admiration showed on the faces of some, and a sense of amazement still lingered in the air. Someone clapped, initially a soft clap, followed by another, then more, until the whole class was applauding. Jamal didn't know how to respond. For so many years he had grown accustomed to being ignored, ridiculed, treated as someone not worth paying attention to. But now, everyone was looking at him differently, no longer with disdain, no longer with contempt. This was the first time he felt truly recognized. But amidst the growing applause, he noticed something more important than anything else. Mrs. Thompson was still standing there, still not clapping, still not showing acceptance in the way the others were. But when Jamal looked at her, he realized something. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him like a lazy student, no longer with suspicion or belittling judgment. For the first time, she was looking at him like a real student, someone she couldn't ignore or take lightly anymore. Jamal didn't need her to say it out loud that she had been wrong, because sometimes silence was a clearer admission than anything else. And for him, that was enough. As the applause began to die down, as the classroom slowly returned to its normal atmosphere, Jamal returned to his seat, but everything had changed. Before, when he entered the classroom, no one paid attention to him. But now, as he walked by, he could feel the eyes of everyone on him. Before, the other students knew him only as the one held back, an invisible shadow. But now, he had made them remember the name Jamal Carter. And this was just the beginning. Jamal sat down in his seat, his breath still not fully steady after the moment that had just passed. The atmosphere in the classroom felt suffocating, weighed down by an invisible pressure, something very different from any other day, something no one could predict or control. The students around him still hadn't stopped staring at him, their eyes filled with astonishment, and for some, perhaps even a hint of respect. But what concerned Jamal the most was not the gaze of his classmates, but the reaction of Mrs. Thompson. He didn't need anyone to clap or praise him, but he wanted to know what she truly thought. He wanted to know if the woman who had looked down on him all this time had enough courage to accept the truth now staring her in the face. She remained standing there, quietly facing the whiteboard, where his solution was still clearly visible, each number etched into the space like an indelible statement that could not be erased. Slowly, she moved closer, gripping her pen as though it were the only thing holding her emotions in check. She bent down, her eyes scanning each line of the equation, each transformation, each equal sign, each symbol that Jamal had written. No one said a word, no one dared to break the silence. The whole class held its breath, knowing this was the most important moment. Jamal saw her eyes shift slightly, no longer filled with mockery, nor with anger or frustration at being proven wrong. It was a look of contemplation, an internal struggle between the pride of a seasoned teacher and the undeniable truth before her. She checked again, then a third time. Her lips pressed together, her eyebrows furrowed. But the more she looked, the more she couldn't deny it. And finally, after a long, suffocating moment, she put the pen down on the desk, stood up straight, and looked directly at Jamal. The answer is completely correct. As soon as those words left her mouth, the classroom erupted. The hushed whispers that had been building up suddenly exploded uncontrollably. The murmurs turned into cheers, and the astonished gazes became awe. A few students began clapping. At first, just one or two, then the whole class gradually joined in, the applause ringing out not out of obligation or politeness, but because they truly couldn't believe what had just happened. Jamal was no longer the repeat student. Now he was a math genius. One student in the front row, still in shock, turned to the person next to them, voice trembling with confusion. I don't even understand that problem." "He didn't just get it right," another voice chimed in, full of surprise. "He did it faster than anyone else." They were still trying to process everything that had just occurred. But for Jamal, he knew everything had changed forever. Mrs. Thompson stood there, not participating in the class's excitement, but Jamal could see the shift in her eyes. For the first time, she was truly looking at him, not through the lens of prejudice. "Jamal," her voice slow, no longer sharp like before but softer, tinged with something resembling respect. "Why haven't you shown this before?" Jamal sat up straight, feeling the weight of the stares still on him. It was a simple question, but to him it carried too much significance. He didn't know how to answer, didn't know how to express what he had gone through, what had kept him from standing up and showing his ability. How could he explain the years of being overlooked, the times he tried to blend into the crowd just so no one would notice him? He looked down at the desk, his finger absent-mindedly tracing the edge of his notebook, where the problems he'd taught himself each night lay. Numbers that had once been a quiet joy, a private world he never thought he'd share with anyone. Then he looked up, his voice low but clear. "I didn't think anyone cared." The room fell silent. No one expected that answer, and certainly Mrs. Thompson didn't either. Jamal looked into her eyes, and for the first time he saw a flash of regret, a realization that perhaps she had been wrong, not just about him, but about many other students as well. She didn't answer right away. She simply stood there, thoughtful, as if considering something far bigger than the math problem on the board, something bigger than this moment. Then she gave a small nod, a gesture that held so much meaning. Jamal knew a door had just opened. He had not only proven his math skills, not only broken Mrs. Thompson's prejudice and that of the other students, he had made them see him in a completely new way. Now, no one could ignore him anymore. The student who had once been held back had stood up and claimed his place, and he knew this was only the beginning. Mrs. Thompson stood still for a long time after hearing Jamal's answer. The whole class seemed to freeze. The whispers, the chatter that had been buzzing just moments ago, all disappeared, replaced by a heavy silence. No more mocking laughter, no more mocking glances, no more excitement at witnessing an impossible thing happening right before their eyes. The atmosphere suddenly became strangely tense, and no one knew exactly what to say or how to react. Mrs. Thompson stared at Jamal, as though trying to understand what he had just said. For someone like her, the answer was not just an explanation. It was a truth she had never considered, a reality she may have inadvertently overlooked throughout her many years of teaching. This time, her voice was no longer sharp or cold. It was slow and calm, as if she were trying to approach a student she had never fully understood. "Why do you never speak up? Why are you hiding your talent?" That question wasn't just for Jamal. It was like a self-questioning, a query she asked herself. Why had she overlooked a student like this for so long? Jamal lowered his head, his fingers unconsciously running lightly along the edge of his notebook. His gaze dropped, no longer tense as it had been when standing in front of the board, but also lacking the confidence he had just shown when proving his ability. He had gotten used to no one paying attention, used to being in the shadows. And now, with so many eyes on him, now that he was no longer invisible, he felt somewhat lost. "I don't think anyone cares." Those words were simple, but carried a heavy weight. The students in the class suddenly fell silent. No one said a word, no one laughed. No one dared to look each other in the eye. Some lowered their heads to the desk. Others secretly glanced at Jamal but quickly turned away, as though ashamed to face the truth. Those who had mocked him, who had called him the kid who got held back, who whispered behind his back every day, now felt very small. Mrs. Thompson continued to stare at him, but this time her gaze no longer held judgment. It was more reflective, softer, as though for the first time she was truly seeing him. Jamal took a deep breath. He didn't want to say it, but he knew this was the moment he had to face it. There was no longer any reason to hide. "I was held back, not because I was failing." He looked up, his eyes bright but filled with a weariness that no 13-year-old should have. "I missed a lot of school. My family is struggling. My mom has to work 2 or 3 jobs to take care of us. My dad works the night shift and only comes home to sleep. I'm the oldest, so I have to watch my little brother. I have to work part-time. I have to help my mom whenever I can. There are days I make it to class, but there are days I can't." Jamal's voice wasn't loud, but each word he spoke rang clearly in the silent room. "The school said I couldn't move up if I didn't attend enough. I couldn't change that." He paused, looking around the classroom where familiar faces sat in silence, no one daring to speak. The kids who once thought he wasn't good enough, that he was just a kid held back, that he didn't belong here. Now they were all facing a truth they had never considered. Because in their minds, a student who was held back was lazy, a kid who didn't do homework, who didn't try, who wasn't smart enough to keep up with the others. But now, they all realized they were wrong. No one in the class had ever really thought about what Jamal was dealing with every day. No one ever wondered why he had to repeat 8th grade instead of moving on to 9th like he should have. No one knew that while they were out playing after school, he had to work. While they were doing homework in their rooms, he was putting his little brother to sleep next to his desk. While they were sleeping soundly in warm beds, he was staying up late under the light of an old desk lamp, teaching himself advanced math just for the pure love of it. They never knew, and perhaps they never cared. Mrs. Thompson kept looking at him, her gaze no longer as stern as usual. It was gentler, but there was something else there, something hard to name, maybe regret, maybe guilt. As a teacher, she had gotten used to evaluating students based on what she saw in class, what was right in front of her. But she hadn't thought about what she couldn't see, hadn't considered why a student might behave the way he did, hadn't thought about the story behind a name on the attendance list. The classroom remained silent. No one knew what to say. The kids who had once mocked him, who had laughed when he sat quietly at the back of the class, who had whispered behind his back saying, "He probably doesn't know anything," now all lowered their heads to their desks, not daring to look directly at him anymore. Because they all knew they were wrong, and nothing could change that. Jamal didn't need them to apologize. He didn't need them to say anything. He just wanted, for once, for everyone to really see him, to truly understand that he was not the failure they had thought. And now, he knew they had seen. The room was still filled with a heavy silence, but it was no longer the silence of disdain or mockery as it had been before. This was a different kind of silence, deeper, sharper, as if the whole class was gradually realizing that they had made a mistake that couldn't be easily fixed with a few casual apologies. Jamal sat there, his back still straight, his gaze no longer avoiding anyone as it had before. He had said everything, and he didn't regret it. He didn't expect sympathy, nor did he need anyone to show understanding. He just wanted them to know the truth, so that later, when they looked at someone they had once underestimated, they would think twice before judging. Miss Thompson stood still, her hands resting lightly on the teacher's desk, but there was a clear change in the way she looked at him. Her gaze was no longer cold, no longer the rigid sternness she always had. It had softened, become more human, as if for the first time she was seeing Jamal for who he truly was, not just a name on the attendance list, not just a kid held back whom she had always thought was irresponsible with his studies. She took a deep breath, as though gathering all her courage to say something she wasn't used to admitting. Jamal. The entire class turned their eyes toward her. No one had ever heard her voice soften like that. Miss Thompson slowly walked toward the front desk, facing Jamal, her eyes never leaving him. She was no longer standing on the podium looking down. This time, she was looking at him on the same level, not as a teacher scolding a student, but as someone trying to understand a person she had once misunderstood. She placed her hand on the desk, her voice lowering, no longer cold, but with a hint of regret, a bit of hesitation, something that had never appeared in her usual stern demeanor. I owe you an apology. The class was motionless. The students who were used to seeing Miss Thompson as strict and unyielding now saw her in a completely different light. A woman who always set high standards, who always demanded that students give their best, was now admitting that she had been wrong. Jamal didn't react immediately. He wasn't someone easily swayed by an apology, but he listened because he knew this wasn't something easy for Miss Thompson. She continued, her voice calm but sincere. I always thought I could tell who the top students were, who needed a push, and who wasn't trying. But with you, I was completely wrong. She paused for a moment, as if carefully choosing her words. I thought you didn't care about learning, that you were just a kid held back for not trying hard enough. I didn't know what you had to face every day, didn't know that the reason you were silent wasn't because you didn't understand, but because you had become so used to being overlooked. Jamal looked her straight in the eye. For the first time, he saw sincerity there, not pity, but true recognition. Miss Thompson slightly lowered her head, a small gesture but one carrying immense weight. I was wrong to judge you, based only on what I saw on the surface, but today you've shown me something more important than anything in the textbook. She looked up, her gaze thoughtful, and then, with an unprecedented respect, she said, You're not just smart, you're a warrior. The class seemed to hold its breath. Those words, coming from Miss Thompson herself, were not empty praise, nor a way to smooth things over. It was a genuine acknowledgement, a respect she had for a student she once thought would never amount to anything. Jamal didn't know how to react in that moment. Part of him wanted to respond, to say that he didn't need the apology, that he hadn't done this to prove anything to her or anyone else. But another part of him understood that this recognition meant more than anything else. It wasn't just because it came from a tough teacher like Miss Thompson, but because for the first time in his life, someone with real authority had seen his worth. And for the first time, he felt that he was no longer an invisible boy. Miss Thompson turned back to face the class, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the students she taught every day, but perhaps had never truly understood. Her voice rang out, clearer, stronger, as though she wanted everyone to remember this moment. What Jamal did today wasn't just solve a difficult problem. He proved something much more important, that we cannot judge someone by what we see on the surface. She looked directly at the students who had once mocked Jamal, who had seen him as just a kid held back with no value. Their eyes now avoided hers, their heads down. And I think we all need to learn that lesson. Jamal felt his chest lighten, not because he needed the apology, but because she had understood. He had been recognized, not just as a smart student, but as someone of true value. Ms. Thompson took a deep breath and then spoke with certainty, not as someone trying to correct a mistake, but as someone truly wanting to create change. And from today, I will never let any student in this class be overlooked again. No one said a word, but Jamal knew that from this moment on, everything had changed forever. The atmosphere in the classroom had not yet fully returned to normal after what had just happened. Although Mrs. Thompson continued to teach as usual, everyone knew that today's lesson was unlike any before. The feeling of change still hung in the air, as if a door had just opened, and everyone in the room knew that no one would leave today's class the same way as they came in. Jamal sat in his seat, but for the first time, he no longer felt like he belonged to the darkness. He no longer felt isolated, belittled, or pushed to the edges as someone without value. The glances directed at him now were different. No longer mocking, no longer condescending. Some people were still awkward, unsure how to face him, but Jamal could sense that they were beginning to respect him, whether they admitted it or not. But what surprised him even more was Mrs. Thompson's reaction. The class ended. Students packed up and left, but when Jamal stood up, Mrs. Thompson called him back. "Jamal, could you stay for a moment?" He paused, a bit hesitant. Some students still lingered in the classroom, and when they heard that, they stopped for a moment but quickly left, leaving only him and Mrs. Thompson in the room. She stood next to the teacher's desk, arms crossed, her gaze softer than usual, more gentle in a way Jamal had never seen before. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened today," she said slowly, her voice calm but firm. "And I believe you deserve a better opportunity." Jamal didn't know what she meant, but he stayed silent and listened. "Have you ever heard about the district's advanced math program?" The question startled him. Of course, he knew about it. It was a program for the top math students, where the best kids from various schools would learn advanced material, tackling much harder problems than in regular classes. He had always dreamed of joining, but it always felt like a distant hope. Jamal looked at her, unsure of what she was implying. "I want to nominate you for that program," she said, her eyes unwavering. His heart skipped a beat. "I've contacted the organizers," she continued, "and I can assure you that they will consider your application if you agree to join." Jamal didn't know how to react. He had never imagined that Mrs. Thompson, the one who had once looked down on him, would be the one to offer him the biggest opportunity of his life. But he also felt anxiety rising within him. Was he really that good? Could he stand among the district's best students? Could everything that had just happened today be a fluke, a fleeting moment of brilliance that he couldn't repeat? Mrs. Thompson seemed to read his thoughts. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice deepening slightly. "You're wondering if you're good enough to join." Jamal lowered his head, not denying it. She stared at him for a long moment, then slowly moved closer. "Jamal, you're not just smart. You have something that many other students don't have." He looked up, meeting her determined gaze. "You have perseverance. You have resilience. Other kids might be talented, but not everyone can stand in front of the board with an entire class waiting for them to fail and still have the composure to do what you did today." Jamal was silent. She continued, slowly but with conviction. "I used to think that grades didn't tell the whole story, and today I'm even more certain of that. But what you did today wasn't luck. It wasn't a one-time moment. It was the result of the nights you spent studying, of the struggles you've overcome. And that's why I believe you deserve a chance to step out of here and go further." Jamal couldn't deny it. He had studied on his own, he had worked hard, he had truly loved math. Not for anyone else, not for grades, but because he wanted to conquer those numbers. But could he go further? He felt the weight of hesitation in his heart. If he agreed, he would have to step out of his comfort zone, stand among the best students, those who had never been looked down upon, who had never been held back in class, those whom everyone believed would succeed. Could he measure up to them? But then, he remembered the moment when he picked up the pen, when everything on the whiteboard became clear in his mind, when the equations began to fall into place according to their own rules, when everyone was stunned because he had done something no one thought was possible. He remembered that feeling, the confidence he felt for the first time in his life. Maybe it was time for him to challenge himself. Jamal looked up, took a deep breath. He looked directly at Mrs. Thompson, his eyes no longer filled with hesitation. "I'll do it." Mrs. Thompson smiled, a rare smile that perhaps no one in the class had ever seen before. "Good job, Jamal," she said, and for the first time, her voice wasn't that of a teacher criticizing him. It was the voice of someone who believed in him. Jamal didn't know what awaited him next, but for the first time, he was no longer afraid. The next morning, as Jamal walked into the classroom, he immediately sensed a noticeable change in the atmosphere. There were no more mocking glances, no more whispers behind his back, no more snide laughs as he passed by. Instead, there were curious, respectful looks, and something Jamal wasn't familiar with: recognition. Before, when he entered the class, no one paid attention. He would silently walk to the back of the room, sit in his seat as if he didn't exist. But today, as he walked past, everyone was watching him. Some whispered softly to each other, fragmented words echoing in the unusually quiet space. That's him. The kid who was held back but solved a problem even the best students couldn't figure out. He's joining the advanced math program. Mrs. Thompson picked him. Some were still awkward, not quite used to changing their perception of him. Some seemed embarrassed, remembering the times they mocked and teased him, and now they had to face the reality that they had completely misjudged him. Jamal didn't say anything, but he could feel each gaze as he quietly made his way to his seat. For the first time, he didn't feel invisible anymore. But what surprised him even more was that someone spoke to him first. As Jamal sat down, a hand gently tapped his shoulder. "Hey, Jamal." He turned around and realized it was David, one of the smartest students in the class, the kid who always scored high and was frequently praised by Mrs. Thompson. David had never spoken to him before because there was no reason to. In David's eyes, Jamal was someone unremarkable. But today, the way David looked at him was different. No more distance, no more indifference. Instead, there was a hint of hesitation, a bit of respect, and perhaps a little admiration. "What's up?" Jamal asked, still not used to someone reaching out to him. David hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Could you show me how to do the problem from yesterday?" Jamal blinked, unable to believe his ears. "David, who always believed he was the smartest in the class, was asking him for help. Jamal looked at David, searching for signs of sarcasm or mockery, but there was only sincerity on his face. Jamal looked down at the desk, thinking for a moment. He had never helped anyone in class before because no one had ever considered asking him for help, but now someone genuinely wanted to learn from him. He nodded. "Sure." David pulled up a chair beside him and opened his notebook. A few moments later, another student came up. "Jamal, can you help me with this part?" Jamal looked up and recognized it was Lisa, the curly-haired girl sitting in the second row, who had never spoken to him before. Jamal furrowed his brow but nodded. Less than 10 minutes later, a few more students started coming over, their faces a mix of curiosity and hesitation. These were people who had never cared about his existence before, but now they wanted to hear from him. The classroom, which had once been the place where Jamal silently retreated into a corner, had now become the place where he was talking with people who had never noticed him before. He no longer felt isolated, he was no longer invisible, and most importantly, he felt like he belonged there. Jamal didn't need anyone to bow their head in apology, or to admit that they had been wrong to underestimate him. Just by looking into the eyes of those around him, he knew that everything had changed forever. He had not only proven that he was smart, but that he deserved to be there. And for the first time, he felt proud of himself. Jamal walked through the door of the advanced math classroom with a mix of excitement and nervousness. He had never stepped into a space like this before. A room without mocking glances, whispers behind his back, or contemptuous looks directed at a kid who had been held back a grade. Instead, he saw students like David, Lisa, and others he had only heard of but never had the chance to stand with. These were the top students in the district, the kids everyone expected to become scientists, engineers, or professors in the future. His palms were slightly sweaty as he pulled out a chair at a desk in the middle of the room. On the desk was a packet of problems that had been distributed earlier, math questions with symbols more complex than anything he had ever seen on Mrs. Thompson's board. But instead of feeling afraid, he felt exhilarated. Mrs. Thompson was right. He wasn't just smart, he was a warrior. Standing at the front of the room was Mr. Parker, the district's advanced math teacher, a middle-aged man with salt-and-pepper hair and sharp, experienced eyes. He scanned the room, his gaze not lingering on anyone too long, but when his eyes met Jamal's, there was a flicker of curiosity, but no doubt. "Hello, everyone," Mr. Parker said, his voice deep but resonant. "If you're here today, it means you've proven something. But remember, being here doesn't mean you've reached the top. It just means you have potential." He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the students as if to emphasize every word. "The question is, can you realize that potential?" No one said anything, but Jamal could feel the intense, charged atmosphere, as if everyone was ready to dive into a fierce intellectual battle. Mr. Parker raised his hand, pointing to the board. And just then, a problem appeared. Unlike the problems in Jamal's old class, this one didn't have step-by-step instructions or a pre-written procedure. It was just a string of complex symbols, interwoven variables like a maze of challenges. There was a moment of silence, and then a few students began scribbling in their notebooks, quickly trying to approach the problem. Jamal stared at the problem, his brain immediately kicking into gear, analyzing each component, breaking it down into manageable steps. Before, when he stood in front of the board in Mrs. Thompson's class, he felt as if the whole world was watching him, waiting for him to fail. But here, in this room, everyone was busy with their own problems. No one cared where he came from or that he had been held back a grade. Here, only intelligence mattered. Jamal took a deep breath, picked up his pen, and began writing. The numbers began to appear on the page. He broke the problem into parts, trying one approach, then discarding it when he realized it didn't lead to the desired result. But instead of feeling confused or scared, he felt thrilled. This was what he loved, what he had spent countless nights under the desk lamp pursuing. Not because anyone forced him, but because he wanted to. He skimmed over one transformation, then another, each line of writing on the paper beginning to connect like a clear chain of logic. Naturally, he immersed himself in his thought process, no longer noticing the time passing. Then, after about 15 minutes, he put his pen down and looked at his final result. He knew it was correct. Jamal looked up and realized that not everyone had finished the problem. Some students were still chewing on the end of their pens, frowning in thought. Others flipped through their notebooks, trying to find their mistakes. He wasn't the only one who had finished, but he was sure he wasn't the slowest. Mr. Parker scanned the room, then spoke. "Who wants to come up and present their solution?" Jamal felt his heart beat a little faster. In his old class, he always stayed quiet, always avoided the teacher's gaze, always tried not to stand out. But today, here, in this room, he didn't want to hide anymore. He raised his hand. A few students turned to look at him, a bit surprised. Perhaps because they had never seen him before, never heard the name Jamal Carter. But he didn't care. Mr. Parker looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Come on up." Jamal stood up and walked to the board. As he picked up the pen and began writing out each step of his solution, he felt a strange surge of confidence rise within him. No more fear, no more feeling isolated. He had stepped into the light, and he was ready to prove that he belonged here. That evening, as all the sounds in Jamal's small home had quieted down, his mother had fallen asleep after a long day of hard work, and his younger brother had curled up under his blanket. Jamal remained at his desk, the desk lamp casting its light on the white notebook in front of him. But tonight, he wasn't burying himself in numbers like he usually did. It wasn't because he no longer loved math. On the contrary, he had never felt such a strong desire to conquer numbers. But this time, he wasn't just writing equations or filling in rows of numbers on the page. This time, he was writing his dream. Jamal had never really thought about the future in this way. Before, every day for him was just about surviving, fulfilling his responsibilities, getting through each class unnoticed, working, helping his mother, taking care of his brother, and repeating it all until he could leave this school without anyone remembering him. But now, everything had changed. For the first time, he didn't feel invisible anymore. For the first time, he was being seen, challenged, placed in a position where he could express himself. And that made him want more. Jamal picked up his pen, his hand no longer trembling as it once did when he was afraid to stand in front of the class. Now, he wrote with certainty, each letter appearing clearly on the page. "I will never be afraid again." He paused for a moment, looking at the words as if he wanted to engrave them into his mind. This wasn't a promise to anyone else. This was a promise to himself. Since he was young, he had always thought he should shrink away, that his intelligence meant nothing if no one cared about it, that it was best for no one to notice him to avoid getting hurt. But now, he realized he didn't have to hide anymore. He had the right to chase his dreams. He had the right to stand where he deserved to be. He had the right to shine. Jamal turned to a new page. He wrote down the first goals in his life that he truly wanted to achieve. Participate in the state math competition. Seek a scholarship to attend a better high school. Never let anyone say I'm not good enough again. He didn't know if he could achieve all of them, but he was ready to try. And for the first time in his life, as he set down his pen, he felt proud of himself. Jamal closed the notebook, turned off the desk lamp, and looked out the window. The night sky in Atlanta was still as dark as usual, with small stars sparkling in the vast sky. Before, whenever he looked up at the sky, he always felt so small, as if his dreams were just weak lights in an endless space. But tonight, when he looked up at the sky, he didn't feel small anymore. He was no longer afraid. He was ready to step into the light. Jamal Carter, the boy who was once considered invisible, who had to carry responsibilities far too great for his age, who was held back a grade and became a laughingstock among his friends, had now risen up and asserted his worth. He had proven that intelligence wasn't just about grades. It was about persistence, determination, and the ability to never give up. Jamal's story wasn't just about math. It was about believing in himself, stepping out of his comfort zone, and not letting the judgments of others define who he was. What about you? Have you ever felt underestimated, looked down upon, but then one day you proved to everyone that they were wrong? Share your story in the comments. If you enjoyed this story and want to continue following other inspiring stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And remember to hit the notification bell so you never miss any videos. Thank you for watching and see you next time.